Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for having me. My name is Dirk Riehle. I'm a professor of computer science, actually, so most of the research I do is engineering research. But I've also, before I took on my current position in academia about half a year ago, I worked in industry for 15 years, mostly in the Silicon Valley, where I worked for startups and large companies alike and looking at how they struggled with open source. So this talk is not about my engineering research, it's really about the observations and experiences and research for how to make open source sustainable from an economic perspective. So I have these three parts. After short touching on how important open source has become in some areas we may not widely know yet, I'll be touching on open source economics more broadly, and then on single vendor open source, which is a way how individual companies use open source as a strategy to provide open source software, but also to earn a living and a good living at that. So I guess I don't really have to explain open source here, but let me say that all these properties of open source, that it's free, that you can modify it, that you can redistribute it, and all of that, is basically given to you as a user as a right by way of the open source license. So we need to realize it's a right given to you through a license, and that there can be many different licenses. If they are open source licenses, they are approved by the Open Source Initiative. And using these licenses, you can play out different business strategies, and I'll touch on that later. This formal definition I just gave is really just that, a formal definition. There's a philosophy. The Free Software Foundation has a stronger philosophy, say, than the Open Source Initiative, but let me stay with the Open Source Initiative here, which says that open source is a development method. It's a better way of developing software with some benefits, like, for example, no vendor lock-in. That used to be true, and it is true still, but it's only partly true. As we'll see, in particular, single vendor open source ignores some of these aspects, and for that we need to look at these different ways of how to slice and dice the open source ecosystem. There is no single type of open source project any longer. They are very different with very different economic motivations. So I guess you know these examples. Everyone recognizes the Linux, Penguin, Tux, and some of the others. What I would like to point out is SugarCRM, Jaspersoft here, business open source software, enterprise software. I saw Alfresco out there, and so open source really is not just for Linux and infrastructure, it really is all over the place, enterprise software as well. My research group did some measurements to see how true is that. On this slide here you see from a project population of 10,000 active projects about 2 years ago, you see the total amount of code being written in the upper line, and the number of active, well-working projects in the lower line. And it looks like we have later data, which is even better, where it shows it's a straight line, and because this is a logarithmic graph, a straight line means exponential growth. That's the best model we have found. So we know now that for many, many years, open source has been growing exponentially in the amount of work being put in, but also, and that is the important recognition, in the number of active, well-working projects all across the different types of software you can have, from infrastructure to business applications. In fact, each individual software project only grows like linearly or quadratically in terms of source code, and what's really driving the growth, the exponential growth, is the growth in well-working projects. They have sprung up everywhere. They are not constrained to infrastructure anymore. So the economic impact, some numbers you probably have seen in some form or another, pretty much already today is, this is an older quote, everyone's using open source in the enterprise. And like 2 or 3 years ago, no, in 2006, so this data is getting old, the total amount of money being earned in the packaged software market, so prepackaged applications like Microsoft Word or so, about 1% was already open source software, mostly the distributors and some single vendor open source. I'll explain what I mean by that later. This is what we are looking at, my research group is trying to figure out. We call it the software end game. How will open source play out in the long term? We have a few data points. So this is an illustration. We haven't been able to finish that yet because, as we all know, predicting the future is pretty hard. But we know the exponential growth at the beginning of the curve. One would expect some kind of inflection point. Nothing can grow exponentially forever. But then we would also want to know, in the total amount of software being written, what percentage of that will be open source software. And if it's only 5%, that's a very different thing from its 50% or 80% or even 100%. I think the speaker before me made a case it probably should be 100%, but of course we don't know how it will play out. So these are the two key figures that will inform, I believe, as well, public policy making at some point of time. Is there an inflection point? And then will open source 10 years, 20 years from now be 50 or 80 or 100% of all software? We don't know that yet, but I think it's something we need to figure out as a research so that we can align, say, investment decisions with it. I think I've made a case here in my general introduction that open source is really available for all types of software. But it raises the question, how does software come about where the old adage of open source, that it is developers scratching their own itch, catering to their own needs, doesn't really apply. And that's, of course, business software. And so that is one thing to consider. But let me move on to the economic motivation of open source. So the way I structure my research with my economics colleagues is I distinguish between open source being developed for a profit motive. Like traditional closed source companies, it is firms who want to earn their living, a very good living. There's also open source in the original spirit of making contributions to public welfare by providing good software for free. So that's the public good or welfare argument. And I also look at it from a labor market perspective. What does it mean to current and future knowledge workers, software developers, who are developing open source software? Here is how I classify open source software, and that's quite an important slide because I think it's instrumental to understand that there are very different types of open source projects and how they are run, and because they are so different, they just behave very differently and you get very different benefits of it. The strongest dimension is on the left, is ownership. So I think you need to, when you look at a given open source project, you need to look at who owns it. Is it a community who owns it, a community of stakeholders, or is it a single software firm who owns the software? And depending on what's the situation, the sub-project will be set up very differently, will be structured very differently. The risks and the benefits that come with it will be very different. So I call it correspondingly community open source versus commercial open source. Examples of community open source are open source projects that are owned by a large community of stakeholders. Linux was developed that way, the Apache web server as well. Commercial, or more specifically single vendor open source, in one of the following slides. That's the MySQL or Alfresco. These are projects that are made available to you under an open source license, so they are open source, but they are owned by a single company, which typically does not let you share in the development. So that's a strong distinction to be made between community open source and commercial open source. And just to clarify things, I also distinguish between whether we are talking about a single project, like the MySQL database, or a distribution or a software stack, like what Red Hat or Canonical or Novell/SUSE is providing you. These distributions, Red Hat is sometimes named as the representative open source company. That may well be true because they are based on open source, but these distributions are a very different business from single project focused companies. So I'm not talking about the distributors here because their intellectual property is actually not the individual projects but what's in between the projects, making all these different projects they put